You might be surprised to learn that the humble lettuce, the leafy green you may occasionally push aside on your dinner plate, once held divine significance to one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. In ancient Egypt, where gods were abundant and every aspect of life was tethered to sacred meanings, lettuce was far more than a salad ingredient. It was a symbol of fertility, of rebirth, and of the mysterious god known as Min. Min, the god of fertility and the harvest, was often depicted as a mummified man with an erect phallus and a lettuce stalk held upright in his hand. Yes, you read that correctly, and no, this is not a modern reinterpretation of ancient imagery. It is an exact depiction found in temple carvings, funerary papyri, and temple reliefs. To truly understand why lettuce was not only consumed but worshipped, we need to walk slowly through the dusty, scorching fields of Middle and New Kingdom Egypt, where divine agriculture and human survival were intimately tied. To begin, the ancient Egyptian economy, its power, its religion, and even its seasonal rituals depended heavily on agriculture. The Nile's annual flooding gave life to otherwise barren lands, and with this fertile soil came crops like barley, emmer wheat, flax, onions, garlic, and yes, lettuce. Lettuce, known to Egyptians as echt, was not just any plant. It had long, straight stalks that exuded a white, milky sap when broken or cut. The connection to male reproductive fluid was not coincidental. It was, in fact, essential. You see, the Egyptians weren't necessarily squeamish about bodily functions. In fact, the natural world was deeply interwoven with myth. The lettuce's milky sap reminded them of semen, and its upright growth seemed to imitate a state of male arousal, both central to Min's role as the god of fertility. In a culture where human reproduction and the fertility of the land were seen as two sides of the same sacred coin, this symbolism was not only acceptable but revered. Min's festivals were elaborate affairs, held in towns like Akhmim and Kift, where his cult was particularly strong. During these ceremonies, men would carry tall stalks of lettuce through the city streets while priests performed rituals invoking Min's blessing on their fields and wives. They offered real lettuce stalks alongside carved representations. These rituals weren't seen as odd or comical. They were central to life. Without fertility, nothing grew, and without growth, no one survived. It might seem mundane, even dull, to speak of plant worship for nearly 2 millennia, yet these beliefs shaped not only religious practices, but entire social norms. Farmers believed that without proper tribute to Min and his sacred lettuce, their crops would fail. Married couples sought fertility not through medicine or science, but through appeasement of deities like Min. If a child was born after a barren spell, it was often seen as a gift from the lettuce-bearing god himself. The sacred nature of lettuce extended even into death. In several tombs across the Theban necropolis, archaeologists have uncovered scenes of deceased noblemen being offered plates of lettuce by their children or wives, offerings to ensure a fertile afterlife. The belief was that just as lettuce brought forth life on earth, it could usher the dead into a new life beyond. In this worldview, something as ordinary as a leafy plant became a bridge between two existences. Interestingly, the kind of lettuce worshipped was not the butterhead or romaine we know today. The wild ancestor of modern lettuce, Lactuca cereola, was taller, more rigid, and bitter to taste. Unlike our cultivated varieties, which have been bred for flavor, ancient lettuce was chosen for its appearance and function rather than its culinary delight. Consumed for medicinal purposes, the plant was believed to help with digestion and even stimulate sexual desire. Its properties were cataloged by Egyptian physicians and later by Greek and Roman writers like Pliny the Elder, who noted its use in rituals of love and fertility. But let's slow down here and take a moment to imagine the heat of the Egyptian sun, the buzz of insects around irrigated fields, and the long shadows of palm trees leaning toward the Nile. Picture yourself among peasants harvesting tall, slightly spiky stalks of bitter lettuce, bundling them carefully, not just for food, but for prayer. In your mud brick house, you place a fresh offering before a carved statue of Min, its features stern and symbolic, in hopes that your wife will conceive this year or your crop will thrive through another dry spell. The sacred lettuce was often eaten fresh during the Opet festival, one of the largest religious celebrations in Egypt. This event honored the Theban triad of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, and the connection to fertility was ever present. Scholars speculate that Min's lettuce was served alongside offerings of bread, beer, and fruits in great processions that wound through Luxor's temple complexes. Why, you might ask, did lettuce endure as a symbol for so long? After all, dynasties rose and fell, gods came and went, but lettuce remained. It is perhaps because it was both omnipresent and mysterious. While other crops like barley and wheat were starchy, filling staples, lettuce stood out as medicinal, magical, and sexual. It was one of the few plants that symbolized life and pleasure. Where most deities were complicated and terrifying, Min was straightforward. Bring him your lettuce, and he would bless your harvest and your bed. There are even records that suggest lettuce played a role in magical spells. Papyrus scrolls from the New Kingdom period contain incantations involving lettuce, directing the scribe to place a stalk under the bed or near the marital chamber to encourage fertility. Even tomb robbers and desert travelers were known to carry dried lettuce stalks as charms. Its scent, though faint, was considered purifying, warding off malevolent spirits and ill fortune. Let's not forget how the Greeks and Romans, even the borrowers of Egyptian thought, adapted these beliefs in their own way. The Romans believed lettuce had soporific properties. It could induce sleep if consumed at night. Perhaps that's where some of our modern associations come from. But for the Egyptians, the lettuce never lulled. It awakened. And yet, one question still lingers, rising like the heat waves off the baked Nile sands. How did a plant once sacred to gods become just another forgotten side dish on a modern plate?
The rise of the lettuce cult and the rituals of the fields. When you imagine a grand ancient ritual, your thoughts may first drift to pyramids, to gold-laden priests chanting before colossal statues, or to silent tombs, echoing with the passage of time. But in the heart of agricultural Egypt, beneath skies baked by the sun and beside the canals of the Nile, some of the most influential and persistent religious practices began not in stone temples, but in fields. In the previous section, we explored the deep connection between the god Min and the curious symbolism of lettuce. In this section, we will walk even further into the rituals that surround this leafy green deity. We'll uncover how the cult of Min grew into a powerful institution, how ordinary Egyptians engaged with lettuce as part of their daily and spiritual lives, and why the plant's sacred status endured across centuries of dynastic change. Let us begin in the town of Akhmim, known in ancient times as Ipu or Chemis, located in Middle Egypt. Akhmim was the heartland of Min's worship and the spiritual capital of his cult. From the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, the people of Akhmim dedicated themselves to Min with remarkable devotion. And always, without fail, lettuce was at the center of the ritual. The most elaborate of these rituals took place during the festival of the first fruits, a time when the earliest harvests were brought before the god to ensure abundance for the remainder of the agricultural cycle. While many Egyptian festivals included parades, feasting, and incense, the festival of the first fruits had a unique feature. a public reenactment of divine fertilization. You might find this strange, even uncomfortable, but fertility was sacred. The priests would carry a statue of men, erect and standing tall, through the city streets, accompanied by singing, rhythmic drumming, and waves of perfumed air wafting from lotus-filled jars. Following the god came rows of farmers, holding freshly harvested lettuce stalks high above their heads. These men, often barefoot, would chant prayers and blessings, asking men to bestow fertility upon the fields and their families. The climax of the festival took place at the temple's threshold, where a high priest, carefully trained in ancient agricultural lore, would anoint the feet of the statue with a blend of oils and crushed lettuce leaves, as incense curled upward like smoke from a distant fire. At this moment, a symbolic act took place. One of the lettuce stalks would be broken, and its white sap dripped onto a small offering table, believed to represent the merging of the divine and the earthly seed into soil. For many years, these rituals were depicted in the form of wall reliefs, particularly in the Temple of Min at Koptos and in other regional shrines. These images showed rows of worshippers, young boys learning to harvest and prepare offerings, and women kneeling beside baskets of lettuce. They provide an incredible view into how an everyday crop was elevated into religious transcendence. It was not only farmers and priests involved, entire communities participated. And not just the elite, but bakers, artisans, and servants each had a role in presenting the sacred plant to their god. Even more curious is how the ritual use of lettuce began to overlap with medicine and midwifery. In medical papyruses, such as the Ebers papyrus, lettuce is prescribed for a variety of ailments. It was used as a laxative, a pain reliever, and even a treatment for poor eyesight. But the most frequent mention, fertility, both for men and women. Egyptian physicians, who were both doctors and priests, advised infertile couples to consume mixtures involving lettuce juice, honey, and ground dates. For some women, lettuce was mashed into poultices and placed near the womb as part of sacred healing. This connection between lettuce and medicine further reinforced its divine status. One scholar called it the only vegetable to live a double life, one in the kitchen and one in the heavens. In the minds of the ancient people, this dual nature was not contradictory, but natural. Everything sacred was also functional. The gods were not distant, they were in the food you ate, the water you drank, and the plants you grew. Interestingly, the influence of the cult of Min reached into the royal court. Pharaohs, especially those in the 11th and 12th dynasties, frequently associated themselves with Min during coronation rituals. One relief in the Temple of Deir el-Bahiri shows Pharaoh Mentuhotep II offering lettuce to Min, his face reverent and solemn. To publicly align oneself with the god of reproduction was to send a clear political message. The king was the guarantor of life, fertility, and continuity. Just as Min fertilized the earth, the pharaoh fertilized the nation's future. By the time of the New Kingdom, during the reign of powerful figures like Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, these rituals had become increasingly institutionalized. Temples began to cultivate their own lettuce fields. These temple gardens, documented in administrative papyruses, were maintained by special classes of gardeners, trained in both agriculture and theology. They knew exactly when to plant the lettuce, the best ways to irrigate, and when to harvest so that the sap was freshest for offering. Some even wrote hymns to lettuce. Imagine, if you will, an entire profession dedicated to sacred farming, where lettuce wasn't just a crop, but a prayer in green. But not everyone accepted these rituals without skepticism. During the Amarna period, when the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten attempted to overthrow Egypt's traditional religious structure in favor of monotheistic worship of the Aten, the sun disk, the cult of Min faced suppression. Temples were closed, images of Min defaced or hidden, and the fields once sacred to his rites fell quiet. For a brief moment, the sacred lettuce was no longer honored.
and yet remarkably, it survived. After Akhenaten's death, the priests of Thebes and Akhmim wasted no time. The cult of Min was restored, temples reopened, and the festival resumed as though it had never left. This resilience speaks to the deep cultural roots the plant had grown not just in soil, but in the Egyptian psyche. Let us not forget the role of women in these rites. While most official ceremonies were led by male priests, women held critical roles in domestic rituals. In the home, wives and mothers were responsible for preparing small household altars to Min. Dried lettuce leaves were burned and prayers whispered over fertility charms. Sometimes women wore amulets shaped like lettuce stalks during childbirth or conception, made of faience or green feldspar. These small details, so easy to miss, tell us how deep the belief ran. And then there is one of the strangest turns of all, the merging of Min with another great Egyptian god, Amun. As Egypt moved into its later dynastic periods, many local deities were merged to simplify an increasingly complex pantheon. Min became Amun-Min, a composite deity that blended the agricultural virility of Min with the solar power of Amun. The image remained potent, a god holding lettuce in one hand and wearing two tall plumes atop his crown. These composite forms allowed rituals to survive, even as the political and spiritual landscape shifted beneath them. Yet by the time the Greeks arrived in Egypt, the sacred lettuce had begun to lose its mystical sheen. Greek scholars, like Herodotus, though fascinated by Egyptian customs, often misunderstood their deeper meanings. To the Greeks, lettuce was a vegetable associated with sleep and death. In Greek mythology, Adonis was said to have died in a bed of lettuce, making the plant a symbol of mourning. This directly clashed with its Egyptian symbolism as a giver of life. As Hellenistic influence spread, the old cults declined. The temples fell into disrepair. The ritual gardens dried up. Yet traces remained. The Romans picked up both the medicinal and symbolic use of lettuce. Though they didn't worship it, they respected its properties. Over time, its role in fertility faded, and lettuce became just another leaf among many, first cultivated for its taste, then its texture, and finally, in modern times, for convenience. And now when we stand in the grocery store and glance over pre-washed romaine and plastic containers, we rarely, if ever, think of the white sap, the sacred juice, the long walks through temple gardens, and the chants to Min whispered under crescent moons. It raises a strange and unsettling question. What other sacred meanings have we discarded over time, buried beneath the weight of practicality and forgetfulness?
From sacred stalk to salad bowl, the slow death of divine lettuce. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when lettuce stopped being divine. Perhaps it was not a single moment, but a slow, creeping erosion, like the Nile's silt gradually burying forgotten temples. The sacred stalk that once graced altars and was offered to gods, whose white sap symbolized the very source of life, quietly slipped from ritual into routine. As we close the final section of our first story, we'll trace the long, slow decline of sacred lettuce in Egyptian society from the twilight of the pharaohs to the rise of classical civilizations and into our modern world. And we'll reflect on what the transformation of such a seemingly trivial plant tells us about the evolution of culture, belief, and the fading rituals of ordinary life. Let's return briefly to Egypt, around the time of the 30th dynasty, the last native dynasty before Alexander the Great swept in from Macedonia. By then, the cult of Min was still active, but it had become a shadow of its former self. Once elaborate festivals were now more localized. Temple priests still tended their ritual gardens, but their numbers had dwindled, and political instability made state-sponsored religious activity increasingly rare. Then came Alexander, who, like many conquerors, did not destroy Egyptian religion outright, but co-opted it. He was declared a son of a moon, who, as we learned in the previous section, had merged with men. Alexander's arrival might have seemed like a promising revival for old cults. Yet, this fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture, what we call the Hellenistic period, was a double-edged sword. While it introduced new architecture, literature, and administrative systems, it also subtly replaced old spiritual frameworks with foreign ideas. In Greek culture, lettuce had an entirely different symbolic weight. It was associated not with fertility, but with death, impotence, and melancholy. The myth of Adonis dying in a bed of lettuce made it a plant of mourning. According to Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Dioscorides, lettuce cooled the body and dulled sexual desire. For a culture that valued rationality and medical balance, lettuce's sedative properties were more important than its spiritual ones. This ideological reversal had consequences. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, descendants of one of Alexander's generals, adopted many Egyptian customs, but often reinterpreted them through a Greek lens. Temples continued to operate, but fewer and fewer Egyptians identified with their original symbolic systems. The tall, upright lettuce, once held high in festival processions, was now something to be cooked, medicated, or ignored. By the Roman period, Egypt had become less a land of gods and more a grain basket for the empire. Rome fed its people with Egyptian wheat, not its theology. Temples still functioned, especially in remote areas like Philae and Dundera, but they became cultural relics. Priests wrote hymns no one read. Statues were cleaned, but rarely worshipped. And in homes across the Nile Valley, lettuce returned to the kitchen. But what happens when belief fades? Does it vanish entirely? Or does it leave echoes? In many rural areas of Egypt, folklore persisted long after official worship ended. Midwives continued to recommend lettuce poultices for fertility well into the Islamic period. Some Coptic Christian villages whispered old phrases while planting lettuce, invoking saints instead of gods, but the action remains strangely similar. In quiet courtyards, grandmothers brewed lettuce tea for insomnia, unaware they were continuing a practice once endorsed by Roman emperors and Egyptian priests alike. Meanwhile, in the larger Mediterranean world, lettuce was being transformed. The Romans began cultivating varieties with softer leaves and milder taste. They bred out the bitterness and reduced the tall, rigid stalks of Lectuca cereola to the more familiar forms we know today. Lettuce became part of the Roman meal, served before courses to calm the stomach, a tradition that survives in the modern idea of a starter salad. The connection to divine power had all but disappeared. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. In Europe, lettuce was still grown, but more for medicine than cuisine. Monks in monasteries copied ancient Roman medical texts and kept gardens where lettuce grew alongside mint, sage, and thyme. The plant was recommended for fever, indigestion, and sleeplessness. In England and France, apothecaries sold lettuce syrup as a sedative. Not once in these texts did anyone mention min, fertility, or sacred rites. By the Renaissance, lettuce began to re-enter the culinary world. Italian and French kitchens experimented with raw greens, pairing them with oil, vinegar, and herbs. Lettuce gained popularity in salatas, a word derived from the Latin salata, meaning salted. The plant that once summoned gods now whet the appetite. It became fashionable among the elite to serve fresh greens before heavier courses. Lettuce had moved permanently into the realm of food. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European explorers brought new lettuce varieties to the Americas. In the New World, it took root quickly, especially in kitchen gardens and later in large-scale agriculture. The rise of refrigeration and transport systems in the 19th and 20th centuries transformed lettuce into a global commodity. Iceberg lettuce became popular in the United States for its crispness and longevity. Soon, pre-cut, pre-washed lettuce could be found in grocery stores around the world. And so, somewhere along that long historical march, from sacred offering to packaged good, the plant lost its myth. The symbolic sap was reduced to nutritional content. The ceremonial stalk was chopped and bagged. But still, if you look closely, you can trace its ghost. Consider this. Lettuce remains one of the few vegetables associated with rest and sleep. Many herbal remedies still contain lettuce extract. Its sedative qualities, known since Roman times, are now studied by modern scientists who confirm that lactucarium, the white fluid found in wild lettuce, acts as a mild analgesic and sedative. Even more curious is how, in the age of information and wellness trends, lettuce has regained some mystique. Articles tout its calming effects. Videos on natural sleep remedies feature lettuce tea. People are rediscovering ancient uses without realizing their origins. In a world that seems to run ever faster, we turn back to this quiet, cooling plant, searching for rest. And what of men? His temples are in ruins, worn down by sand and time. His festivals are forgotten. His priests are long gone. But in the museums of Cairo, Berlin, and London, you can still find his statues, always with the same form, mummified, crowned, and unmistakably holding a lettuce stalk. Tourists pass by without noticing. Children giggle at the awkward figure. Tour guides rush past on their way to the more dramatic pharaohs and gods. But if you pause and look, if you truly take in the strange image of a god with lettuce in his hand, you may feel it, the quiet dignity of forgotten things. There's a strange beauty in the idea that belief can linger in objects even after its meaning is lost. The lettuce we eat today is not sacred, but it carries the shadow of sacredness. It is not divine, but it was once believed to be. And in a world so eager to move forward, that backward glance can be strangely comforting. You might ask yourself, what other parts of our daily life were once divine? What other things have we stripped of meaning in the name of progress, only to long for them again when silence falls? And as you sit down to your next meal, perhaps with a side salad you barely think about, you might pause just for a moment and remember that thousands of years ago, under the unrelenting sun of the Nile Valley, a farmer once lifted a lettuce stalk to the heavens, praying not for pleasure or health, but for life itself. A plant, a god, and a people bound together by the quiet act of planting a seed.
Story 2. The Medieval Laundry List. How doing the wash shaped a civilization. Buckets, ashes, and boredom. The true weight of medieval laundry. You might not think of laundry as a subject worthy of historical inquiry. In our modern world, it's something we do almost absent-mindedly. Throw the clothes in the machine, add soap, press a button, and walk away. But in the Middle Ages, the act of washing clothes wasn't merely a chore. It was a back-breaking, week-long event that influenced class divisions, gender roles, trade, water access, and even architecture. In this first section, we will step back into the damp alleys and thatch-roofed cottages of medieval Europe to explore the forgotten world of laundry. It's not glamorous, it's not thrilling, but it was essential. And in that quiet necessity, we find a remarkable story of survival, innovation, and the unexpected influence of soap and cloth on society. Let's begin by clearing up a misconception. Most medieval people were not filthy.
Certainly, they didn't wash as frequently or as fragrantly as modern standards might demand, but cleanliness of at least body linen was considered important, especially among the lower and emerging middle classes. Nobility had the means to ignore dirt, sometimes cloaking it in perfume and powdered wigs. But for the common person, dirt meant disease, and disease was deadly. Now, let's imagine a typical washing day in a small English village around the 13th century. It's early spring, and the weather is just warm enough to risk airing linens. You're a woman, because laundry was almost always women's work, and you've been saving up garments all winter. The big wash, often called the Great Washing, only happened a few times a year for larger items like bed sheets, tablecloths, and wool cloaks. Undergarments and linen shifts were washed more regularly, perhaps every few weeks. Still, even these were significant tasks. First, you gather all the linen. Wool and linen are the primary fabrics used in the medieval household. Cotton was rare and mostly imported, reserved for the wealthy. Linen comes from flax, and it's durable, breathable, and incredibly difficult to bleach. Wool, especially undyed wool, holds water and smells terribly when wet, but it was warm and widely used. You lug the clothes to the washing area. This might be near a stream or river if you're rural. If you're urban, perhaps a public wash house or a communal stone trough. In some places, you carry the water back to your yard. You need a lot of water, hundreds of liters. There's no running tap. You've drawn this water by hand, bucket after bucket, and boiled it over a fire kindled before dawn. Before soap became widespread, women used lye to clean fabric. Lye was made by pouring water through wood ash, often collected from the hearth, and letting it sit in a barrel to leach. The resulting liquid was highly alkaline, capable of breaking down oils and stains. This mixture would be added to the boiling water, creating a caustic, slippery liquid that burned the skin and stung the eyes. Garments were stirred in large copper cauldrons with wooden paddles. The process resembled cooking more than washing. Items were soaked, boiled, lifted, and beaten with batons or boards. The beating helped loosen dirt from the weave of the fabric. Women had to be careful not to damage their clothes. Boiling weakened fibers, and lye could bleach or disintegrate fine linen. And then came rinsing. Imagine for a moment a heavy woolen cloak saturated with water. It can weigh more than 20 pounds. Now picture lifting that cloak along with several sheets and undergarments again and again to wring and rinse them in clean, cold water drawn once more by hand. This rinse might occur in a nearby stream if you were lucky, or else in separate barrels set aside just for rinsing. And you're still not finished. Clothes had to be wrung, aired, and dried. Linen was spread over bushes, hedges, and even roof ridges. In towns, lines were strung between windows. Public drying areas often became social spaces where women exchanged gossip, recipes, and local news. These informal networks shaped communal life far more than historians once believed. In castles and manors, the laundry staff was part of the domestic hierarchy. The lavandera, or washerwoman, was beneath the cook and the lady's maid, but above the scullery workers. She reported to the chamberlain or house steward and kept inventories of linen stores, a position that required trust and discretion. Interestingly, monasteries had the most organized laundry systems. Monks wore woolen robes, which were notoriously difficult to clean, but their routines were strict. Laundry days were scheduled. Cloisters often included built-in washing areas with drains and flow systems that predate some city plumbing by centuries. Monks even had specific rubrics for washing sacred linens used in Mass.
Cleanliness, they believed, was next to godliness, especially in garments touching the body of Christ. The laundry process didn't end with cleaning. There was ironing, or something close to it. Linen items, once dry, were laid flat and smoothed with stones or rolled with heavy glass balls. In wealthier homes, heated metal tools, precursors to the modern iron, were used to press clothing. Starch, made from wheat or rice paste, was sometimes applied to collars and cuffs to keep them stiff. Over time, laundry became not just a domestic task, but a commercial service. By the 14th century, large cities like Paris, London, and Florence had professional laundry districts. Washerwomen would collect soiled clothes from clients, clean them in public facilities, and return them for a fee. The industry was dominated by women who formed guild-like organizations to regulate prices and maintain standards. But laundresses carried a complicated social image. On one hand, they were seen as necessary and industrious. On the other, their presence in public rivers and alleys, sleeves rolled, legs exposed, and voices loud, made them targets of moral scrutiny. Medieval literature often portrayed washerwomen as gossips, seductresses, or comic figures, though in reality, their work was dangerous and vital. The act of washing exposed them to harsh chemicals, freezing water, and chronic back strain. There are accounts of women collapsing from exhaustion on washing days. Many suffered skin damage from repeated contact with lye. Others caught infections from handling soiled linens from plague victims or surgical procedures. Yes, hospitals had their own laundresses too. In fact, during the outbreaks of the Black Death, laundry became a front-line defense. Linens used by the sick were burned or washed in vinegar and ash. Washerwomen were among the first to fall ill due to prolonged exposure. Their sacrifice is rarely recorded, but their role was crucial in managing hygiene before the age of germ theory. If we zoom out, laundry in the Middle Ages reveals a deeper truth. The domestic sphere shaped civilization. While kings and knights rode into battle, it was women, boiling, scrubbing, lifting, and drying, who kept fabric clean, homes functional, and entire communities from slipping into disorder. The silent rhythm of washing days formed the background beat to medieval life. Even water access was influenced by laundry needs. Many towns expanded water infrastructure to support washhouses. Aqueducts were not only for drinking water, they supplied public fountains, troughs, and cisterns where laundry could be done. In some places, people were taxed for excessive use of water, especially during droughts, when washing was considered wasteful compared to drinking. You might ask, how could something so boring and repetitive carry so much weight? It's because laundry wasn't just about soap and water. It was about survival. A clean linen shift reduced lice and skin disease. Clean bedsheets meant a better chance of recovering from a fever. And in a world where clothing indicated class and station, clean garments opened doors. For a poor woman trying to find work, presenting herself in a spotless apron could be the difference between employment and starvation. And yet, for all its importance, medieval laundry left few traces in the grand annals of history. You won't find epic poems about boiling sheets. No great battles were fought over soap. No kings wrote letters praising the rinse cycle. Still, the work went on, day after day, century after century, performed by hands that never held a quill or wore a crown. And this leads us to a rather ordinary but puzzling question. If the world was held together by such invisible labor, why did so few people write it down?
The factory bells and political echoes. You might imagine that a radical change like the introduction of the 7-hour workday would have swept across Sweden like a roaring fire, burning away long work hours and replacing them with progress and prosperity. But history rarely moves that cleanly. Instead, like the slow turning of gears in an aging factory, the transition was halting, complicated, and in many ways boring. And yet, it's in these boring details that the true lessons lie. In the early 1930s, as the world grappled with the Great Depression, Sweden found itself in a unique position. Unlike many other industrialized nations, Sweden had begun laying the groundwork for a social democratic society. The political rise of the Swedish Social Democratic Party in 1932 brought with it a vision for a more humane and equitable society. Their proposal? To restructure the workday so that people didn't live solely to toil, but could also enjoy family, leisure, and learning. It was in this context that the idea of a 7-hour workday gained traction, not across the entire nation, but through carefully designed government trials and progressive business owners who believed that better working conditions could result in more efficient output. And so, in cities like Malmö and Gothenburg, and even in pockets of Stockholm, the bells that marked the start and end of the factory day began to ring at slightly different times. Factories became quiet at 3 p.m. On paper, this shift might seem uneventful, but in the daily routines of workers, it was a seismic change. You see, time was a rigid structure for industrial workers. Wake at 5 a.m., start work by 7 a.m., break at noon, and finish at 4 or 5 p.m. with weary bones and aching backs. Shortening the workday forced factories to rethink everything, from shift changes to production quotas. Machines didn't stop because humans needed rest, and capital certainly didn't pause for social reform. One of the first industries to pilot this reform was the textile sector, an industry that had historically employed thousands of women in monotonous and exhausting work. The Lina fabric in southern Sweden became an early example. Management had long struggled with absenteeism, particularly during the winter months when illnesses spread quickly in the poorly ventilated buildings. With the shortened day, something curious began to happen. Workers arrived more consistently, production remained steady, and surprisingly, waste declined. Fewer hours meant sharper focus and less fatigue. Still, not everyone was convinced. Opposition came, predictably, from some corners of industry and finance. Conservative business owners warned of reduced profits, reduced output, and a weakening of the work ethic. Editorials in newspapers warned that a leisure class might emerge, idle workers who spent their extra time in cafes or, heaven forbid, reading novels instead of sharpening skills. But beneath this conservative pushback lay something more structural. The entire industrial economy was built on labor time. From payroll calculations to insurance premiums, from the scheduling of train deliveries to the operation of coal-fired power plants. The duration of labor was a fundamental metric. Changing it was not simply a moral or political question, it was an engineering challenge. In Gothenburg, a large shipyard attempted a trial. Rather than reducing total work, they staggered shifts. The day was divided into 2 7-hour blocks, allowing the yard to remain active for a full 14 hours, but with rested workers and cleaner changeovers. This model intrigued observers abroad, particularly in France and Germany, where labor unrest was brewing. Swedish officials began publishing modest reports, boring pages of charts and footnotes,
documenting the effect of each change. These papers were not widely read, but they were influential in policymaking circles. This was a time before TED Talks and productivity podcasts. Ideas spread through paper, coffee shop meetings, and political unions. But one thing was clear. The shortened day was beginning to alter Swedish life in more ways than one. With extra time in the afternoons, many workers went home and took part in local associations, choirs, amateur sports, study circles. The famed folkbildning, or popular education movement, flourished. Workers, for the first time, could attend evening classes without risking exhaustion or neglecting their families. One worker in a small mining town reportedly used the extra hour to learn bookkeeping and later helped form a workers' co-op grocery store. These stories didn't make headlines, but in small ways, they reshaped communities. Still, it's important not to romanticize the transition. While some industries saw benefits, others struggled. In agriculture, for example, the idea of a fixed workday had always been a bit alien. Cows do not care for schedules, and crops don't ripen according to union agreements. For rural Swedes, the 7-hour day felt like an urban experiment, not irrelevant, but distant. In one notable instance, a paper mill in Värmland implemented the change, only to see production dip drastically. The machinery required continuous monitoring, and with fewer hours on site, minor problems were missed and became major. The plant reverted to an 8-hour day within 6 months. Workers weren't upset. They appreciated the effort, but recognized that not every change could succeed in every setting. Meanwhile, politics kept grinding. The Social Democrats continued their slow, determined reform agenda, focusing on pensions, education, and housing. The 7-hour day became a sort of quiet experiment, endorsed in theory, but only partially implemented. In 1938, a formal review of the trials concluded that while quality of life had improved for workers in test groups, broad national implementation would require decades of transition. And so, it wasn't a revolution. It wasn't a universal decree from Stockholm. It was instead a slow seep, an idea that filtered through committees, factories, and the lived experiences of everyday people. For some, it worked beautifully. For others, it created confusion and friction. But the most interesting aspect, how it changed the conversation. Once people tasted shorter hours and saw that productivity could remain stable, the idea became less radical and more inevitable. Union leaders began to bargain not just for wages, but for hours. Politicians began to speak about the dignity of time. Parents spent more time with their children. Library attendance increased. Literacy rates quietly climbed. By 1940, the 7-hour workday was no longer a trial. It was a legitimate bargaining chip, a policy goal, a cultural shift. So when we look back now, nearly a century later, it may be tempting to see the 7-hour workday as a failed or forgotten policy. But if you look closely at the data, at the lived stories, and even at modern work culture in Sweden, where work-life balance is often cited as among the world's best, you'll see the fingerprints of that slow, quiet change. Still, the question lingered in many minds back then. If 7 hours of work is enough to keep society functioning, what else could we change about time, labor, and the purpose of our lives?
The fall of lettuce's legacy and the quiet survival of sacred green. As you make your way further into the sands of Egypt's long memory, the tale of lettuce's sacredness begins to wither, much like the Nile receding in a drought year. By the twilight of Egypt's ancient dynasties, the grand temples of men were growing quieter, and the statue-bearing processions that once centered around this unassuming vegetable became fewer and far between. But what happened to the lettuce? Did it simply fall out of favor with the gods, or was it swept away in the broader tides of time, conquest, and changing tastes? Let's trace the quiet descent of a once sacred plant. By the time the New Kingdom gave way to the Third Intermediate Period, circa 1070 BCE, Egypt was no longer a unified and powerful civilization it once was. The central authority of the pharaoh weakened, priesthoods grew more autonomous, and the country splintered into local powers. Temples that once drew offerings from across the Nile Valley saw their donations dwindle. Min, the once revered god of fertility and agriculture, his tall white crown rising proudly above his hardened posture, began to fade from prominence. And with his decline, so too declined the ritualistic importance of his leafy green companion. Lettuce, which once stood firm and erect as a symbol of potency and divine power, now seemed like a relic of an older, more optimistic age. As the Greeks set their eyes on Egypt during the Hellenistic period, particularly under the rule of the Ptolemies, 305 to 30 BCE, Egyptian religion underwent both transformation and hybridization. Greek gods were merged with Egyptian deities. Amun became Zeus Ammon. Thoth became Hermes Trismegistus. Men? Well, he was somewhat awkwardly folded into the persona of Pan, another god of fertility, wild nature, and sexuality. But this merger was more symbolic than devotional. Lettuce didn't make the journey. The Greeks had their own food taboos and plant preferences. To them, lettuce was associated with death, decay, and infertility, a belief stemming from their myth of Adonis, who died beside a bed of wilting lettuce. So, in an ironic twist of fate, what had once symbolized life and virility for Egyptians came to mean almost the opposite in Greek-influenced culture. A sacred green had wilted under foreign skies. Under Roman occupation, 30 BCE onward, Egypt became the breadbasket of the empire. Grain mattered more than lettuce. Though the Romans were skilled agriculturalists, their primary interests in Egypt were strategic and economic. Sacred groves became agricultural estates, temples fell to disrepair, or were co-opted for civic use. The lettuce remained on farms and in gardens, but its sacred pedigree faded further. Now, lettuce was consumed as a health food. Roman authors like Pliny the Elder wrote about its use as a sleep aid and digestive helper. No longer did it represent cosmic fertility or masculine strength. Instead, it was being recommended as an after-dinner digestive aid by imperial physicians. It wasn't entirely forgotten. Min's statues still stood, and some cultic practices continued in isolated regions, but the lettuce no longer stood tall in religious rituals or temple iconography. It had become simply a leaf. Centuries later, when Islamic rule established itself in Egypt, many of the ancient cults had long disappeared. Islam brought its own dietary laws, medical traditions, and cultural taboos. Lettuce was still eaten. Arab agricultural manuals described it in detail, but its mystical past was no longer part of the collective memory. What had once been sacred now survived mostly through oral traditions, apothecary texts, and scattered notes in Greco-Roman herbals. Some medieval European herbals, passed down through Islamic translations, still mentioned lettuce as having sleep-inducing properties, and some even alluded to its aphrodisiac qualities, though they couldn't quite agree whether it caused desire or dulled it. Min was now forgotten by name, his stone form buried beneath centuries of sand. But the lettuce persisted, not as godly symbol, but as everyday food. Its survival was not divine, but mundane, quiet, almost boring. And yet therein lies its miracle. Fast forward to the 19th century. As European archaeologists descended upon Egypt, driven by colonial interest and romanticized visions of lost civilizations, they began to unearth temples, tombs, and artifacts. In the inscriptions and reliefs found on the walls of places like Karnak and the ruins of Akhmim, researchers noticed the ever-present imagery of the god Min, often depicted with an erect palace and a long stalk-like plant near him. At first, the identity of that plant was the subject of debate. Was it celery? A reed? Some exotic Nile herb? No. Through comparative analysis, botanical study, and iconographic interpretation, the answer emerged clearly. It was lettuce. The same lettuce you find in your sandwich today, Lactuna sativa. This revelation fascinated scholars not just because of its religious significance, but because of how dramatically cultural meanings could shift. A plant once associated with virility, worshipped in sacred processions and preserved in the architecture of grand temples, was now grown by the acre and sprayed with pesticides for global supermarkets. There was something profoundly humbling about that. Today, when you walk through a produce aisle or pick up a bag of salad greens, you likely give little thought to lettuce's past. It is mundane, functional, unremarkable. But lettuce has survived empires. It outlasted pharaohs, conquered kings, religious upheavals, and colonial invasions. It traveled from temple altars to lunch tables. Its significance shifted from the divine to the digestive, from the spiritual to the nutritional. And perhaps that's the truest form of immortality. Lettuce doesn't need to be sacred to survive. It just needs to be useful. And in its boringness, its quiet crunch, its predictable presence, it holds a kind of timeless power. So the next time you see a head of lettuce, imagine it not just as food, but as an artifact. One that bore witness to ceremonies under the Egyptian sun, that stood beside gods in the carvings of limestone walls, and that was once believed to carry the essence of life itself. From sacred symbol of virility to your side salad at dinner, how many plants can say they've lived such a life? But then again, does the lettuce remember?
Story 3. The Bureaucracy of Clay. Life in the Sumerian city of Lagash. Clay tablets and temple ledgers. The birth of Sumerian paperwork. You find yourself in southern Mesopotamia, around 2400 BCE. The air is dry. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers meander sluggishly through a landscape of reeds, dust, and sun-baked mud. Somewhere between these rivers lies the Sumerian city of Lagash. It is not a majestic place by modern standards. There are no towering marble columns or lush gardens, no palaces glittering with gold. What Lagash offers instead is something quieter and perhaps more enduring: bureaucracy. This is not the kind of bureaucracy you encounter today through endless emails or confusing online portals. This is bureaucracy born in clay, forged by styluses and hardened in the fires of ancient kilns. It is dry, meticulous, often repetitive, and yet it shaped the world. Let's begin not with kings or gods, but with the scribes nameless to us, but powerful in their own quiet way. These men, and occasionally women, sat cross-legged on clay floors with damp tablets resting on their thighs.
their styluses, often made of reeds, etched into wet clay the business of the city. Grain tallies, livestock counts, temple transactions, labor assignments, and more. It is from their hands that one of the earliest known bureaucratic systems emerged. Lagash was one of the major cities of ancient Sumer, situated in what is now southeastern Iraq. It was surrounded by smaller satellite towns and agricultural villages that helped sustain the city proper. Governed by an ensi, a kind of city governor, Lagash boasted a central temple dedicated to the god Ningirsu, an enormous complex that dominated city life. But it was not the god who made the temple powerful. It was the paperwork. Inside temple granaries and storage houses, scribes recorded every measure of barley that entered and exited. These records were made not for poetry or glory, but for control. Every field harvested, every cow born, every worker assigned a task. Each was documented in fine cuneiform on clay tablets. Many of these tablets were filed away for reference, some buried under layers of future activity, only to be discovered thousands of years later. Archaeologists would find entire archive rooms filled with these baked tablets, like an ancient version of a corporate records department. One room in the city of Girsu, a district of Lagash, yielded over 30,000 such tablets. Why so much clay? Paper did not exist in Lagash, neither did ink. Clay, however, was abundant. Scribes shaped it into small rectangular slabs, pressed their styluses into it, and either let the tablet dry in the sun or baked it in kilns for durability. These tablets were durable in a way modern documents are not. They could last for millennia, and many have. But the content? Well, it wasn't exciting. One tablet might read, 12 sela of barley allocated to Enlil Idin, temple gardener, for daily rations. Or, 7 oxen were transferred from the temple of Bao to the workshop of Ernanche, witnessed by Lu Gula and Pabil. Repeated, dozens of times. Variations of the same transaction. Sometimes scribes added cylinder seal impressions to authenticate the tablet, rolling a carved cylinder across the wet clay to leave a decorative signature. Imagine you are that scribe. You have spent your entire life mastering cuneiform, not for creative writing, but for the art of record keeping. Your eyes are tired. Your fingers are cracked. Your job is to make sure that not a single sheep goes unaccounted for. You are the quiet architect of civilization. Who kept the records and why? In Sumerian society, the temple was more than a religious center. It was an economic engine. It owned land, employed laborers, raised livestock, and managed the distribution of food and goods. The temple functioned much like a corporation, with the ensi at the top and various overseers, foremen, and scribes underneath. These scribes didn't just record numbers. They ensured that quotas were met, rations were properly distributed, and workers were where they were supposed to be. Failure to record properly could result in punishment, not necessarily for the scribe, but for the officials relying on their records. The tablet was proof. Without it, there was no trust. Lagash was among the first places to institutionalize this kind of administrative control. It wasn't about trust between individuals anymore. It was about trust in the system, on the tablet.
Among the thousands of tablets found in Lagash and Girsu, many list the daily rations allocated to workers. Bread, beer, onions, and barley were standard. One laborer might receive a daily ration of 2 sila of barley and 1 jug of beer, while another, perhaps an artisan or foreman, might receive twice as much. Even infants had tablets. 1/2 sila barley ration for the infant daughter of the weaver's assistant. By documenting these rations, the city ensured fairness, or at least hierarchical fairness. Higher-ranking individuals received more, but everyone was accounted for. Interestingly, the Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system, which meant their accounting was in sexagenal. So a worker's ration wasn't 10 units, but perhaps 1/6 of a gur, or 30 sila, making math particularly tedious without a calculator. Grain was currency. It was stored, measured, taxed, and distributed under intense supervision. Temples acted as banks and warehouses, and Lagash was known for its centralized economy, more tightly regulated than many of its neighbors. This bureaucratic grain economy extended into trade. Merchants kept logs of barley shipments exchanged for goods from distant cities. Other tablets recorded disputes over land boundaries or claims of unpaid debts, complete with names of witnesses and seals of approval. The survival of these dry, repetitive records gives us the clearest picture of Sumerian life, not through myths or kingship, but through barley tallies. Toward the end of Lagash's bureaucratic peak, around 2350 BCE, a governor named Urakagina rose to power. His name is known not because he built great temples, but because he enacted some of the first legal reforms ever recorded. In response to growing public dissatisfaction, perhaps over corruption or inequality, Urakagina introduced laws limiting the power of the temple and the economic elite. He reduced taxes on widows and orphans, banned the forced sale of homes, and limited the priesthood's control over commerce. One inscription reads, "The houses of the blind, the poor, and the destitute shall not be taxed." But even this reform was recorded in clay, with scribes, with ledgers. The bureaucracy continued. What we don't know. Despite the wealth of documents, we know little of the personalities behind them. The scribes remain faceless. We don't know how they felt, if they ever grew weary of documenting another goat's birth, or if they felt pride in their perfectly aligned cuneiform. We can only wonder how this massive, silent bureaucracy shaped the psyche of a society that lived more by ledger than by law. And that brings us to the next chapter. As Lagash's scribes continued to inscribe the minutiae of daily life, barley, sheep, beer,
The city that couldn't breathe. When the clock struck midnight on December 6th, 1952, London was still buried in the yellow-gray haze that had descended the day before. It was no longer a fog in the traditional sense. It was thicker, heavier, and, most disturbingly, still. You couldn't walk through it as much as you pushed against it, like wading through smoke-drenched curtains. The air felt damp, yet strangely ashen. It clung to clothes, seeped into hair, and left behind a strange metallic taste on the tongue. And it was silent. Even the usual buzz of London,
The buses, the hum of life, the market noise, and the footsteps of hurried commuters was muted. The Great Smog, as it would later be called, had not simply darkened the skies, it had muffled the very rhythm of the city. In hospitals across the capital, doctors were already beginning to notice something unusual. The casualty numbers were ticking up, but not due to any outbreak or recognizable epidemic. These weren't influenza patients, they were people who couldn't breathe. Their lungs wheezed like rusted bellows. Children, and the elderly in particular, arrived coughing black phlegm, their lips tinged blue from lack of oxygen. But it was stranger than that. Animals began showing signs of distress. In Smithfield Market, one of the largest meat markets in London, cattle that had been brought into the city by train or lorry were collapsing in their pens. Some lay down and refused to rise. The air was poisoning them too. It's important to understand how utterly unprepared the city was for this. London had always had fog. It was part of its cultural DNA. Poets had written about it. Painters had depicted it in moody brushstrokes. Sherlock Holmes thrived in it. But this was something else. This wasn't poetic, it was oppressive. But the bureaucratic wheels of government moved slowly. The fog had crept in on a Friday. By Sunday, it was clear this wasn't passing quickly. But offices were closed. Public health authorities were hesitant to call it a crisis. Londoners, ever stoic, tried to adapt. Still, the signs were everywhere. Schools closed not because of panic, but because children simply couldn't see to get to them. Some classrooms were lit by multiple oil lamps, and teachers gave up trying to maintain attendance. Theaters shuttered performances not from low ticket sales, but because audiences couldn't see the stage. Ambulances ceased operating altogether, not because of vehicle issues, but because the drivers couldn't find the homes they were called to. In parts of the East End, families huddled in their homes with windows closed tight, yet indoors offered little escape. The thick coal smoke seeped through the tiniest cracks. The curtains turned gray. Bed linen smelled like chimney soot. People wrapped scarves over their mouths, even while indoors. By December 7th, the death toll had started to rise more visibly. But it wasn't bombs or blitz this time. It was the air. There were no explosions, no sirens, just the invisible hand of the atmosphere closing around the city's lungs. In the local newspapers, buried under typical weekend features and advertisements for electric toasters and Christmas ornaments, small reports trickled in. One read, quote, "Visibility at London Airport reduced to 0, unquote. Another, quote, "Horse found collapsed outside Paddington Station, cause unknown," unquote. But by now, doctors had an inkling. The human lungs were not made to inhale sulfuric acid, carbon monoxide, or microscopic soot particles in such quantities. And yet, each Londoner was inhaling the equivalent of several packs of cigarettes a day just by existing. For those already ill, especially those with bronchitis, emphysema, or tuberculosis, the fog was no mere nuisance. It was deadly. The death of Ivy Reynolds on December 8th was one of the earliest noted in medical logs. She had been suffering from asthma, but managed well with medication. That week, however, her wheezing became more severe. Her parents rushed her to the hospital, but the ambulance took too long. It had gotten lost in the fog.
She died in the hospital lobby before ever seeing a doctor. Tragically, Ivy's case wasn't unique. By now, mortuaries were filling up faster than anticipated. Coffins, in short supply during the post-war austerity years, became a commodity. Funeral services were delayed. Morgue workers recorded death after death labeled simply as respiratory failure, chronic bronchitis exacerbation, or cardiac arrest likely due to smog exposure. Still, officials hesitated. London had lived through worse, hadn't it? The Blitz, the war, the rationing. Surely a bit of fog was no match. But this wasn't any fog. By the fifth day, scientists and environmentalists began to suspect the full truth. The combination of factors, such as cold, windless weather, increased coal burning, and a city shaped like a bowl, had created a kind of atmospheric pressure trap. It was holding pollutants low to the ground, refusing to let them disperse. The inversion layer above London acted like a lid. Imagine London as a teapot, simmering away with no way for steam to escape. It was filled with its own breath, choking slowly. Strangely, there was a moment of eerie beauty in the chaos. Lights from street lamps, now barely effective, cast surreal halos. Some pedestrians recalled seeing a yellow orb where the moon should be. Others describe walking into people or objects, unable to see more than a foot ahead. Stories emerged of buses guided by men walking with lanterns. On the Thames, riverboats stayed docked. Pilots reported that the river had vanished entirely from view, replaced by an undulating wall of dirty gold. Even Tower Bridge seemed to melt into the haze. Meanwhile, shopkeepers wiped their windows clean, only to find them re-sooted minutes later. London had become a city of shadows and outlines. Sounds were muffled. The streets were empty. And yet, life tried to continue. People still needed bread and milk. Bakeries ran out of flour. Milkmen, unable to drive, walked their routes. Some used whistles to let residents know they had arrived. Others simply left bottles at fog-covered doorsteps and hoped for the best. In Soho, pubs remained open, though drinkers arrived looking like coal miners. The beer tasted oddly smoky, and laughter, muted and infrequent, was met with coughing fits. On December 9th, 5 full days after the fog had first appeared, a shift in the wind finally arrived. The skies above began to clear, slowly, almost reluctantly. It wasn't a sudden lifting, but a gradual dilution. By midday, Londoners could once again see rooftops and street signs. By evening, they could see the stars. But what they saw on the ground was far more unsettling. Hospitals issued preliminary figures. Already over 4,000 dead, most from respiratory issues. Some doctors warned the true number might be much higher. The final estimate would eventually rise past 12,000, though the true toll may never be known. Londoners now began to understand what had happened. They hadn't just experienced a foggy weekend, they had lived through one of the deadliest environmental disasters in recorded history. And yet, the silence from officials was deafening. There were no emergency declarations, no rapid policy changes, no grand public statements from the Prime Minister. Life resumed. Coal fires were relit. Buses ran. The smog was gone, but its shadow lingered. In the weeks that followed, the people of London would begin to ask, how did this happen? Why was nothing done sooner? And more importantly, could it happen again? But those answers wouldn't come easily.
The Great Smog of 1952 had lifted, but its story was far.
Melting fortunes and the inevitable thaw. You are now lying in the waning light of the 19th century, with the chill of the last great blocks of natural ice fading beneath the pressure of steam and steel. The world is warming not just by degrees, but by the relentless hiss of machines, the sudden shriek of locomotives, and the drone of electric fans. The age of ice carved, hauled, floated, and stored by hand is vanishing, drop by drop. But in this fading moment, let us linger on the last chapter of the global ice trade and consider the quiet crumbling of a cold empire. By the 1860s and 1870s, the once thriving ice business was already showing cracks. Artificial refrigeration, which began as an experimental curiosity, was becoming more consistent and reliable. Entrepreneurs were no longer entirely at the mercy of weather patterns or warm winters, which could destroy an entire season's profits. In the American South, beer brewers, meat packers, and food distributors began experimenting with mechanical refrigeration. Initially crude and temperamental, these early systems used ammonia and compressed air. By the 1880s, engineers like Carl von Linde in Germany and Charles Tellier in France had refined refrigeration to a level that made it viable for industrial purposes. Meat could be shipped across oceans without a single drop of melted ice. And just like that, the foundation of the ice trade and its monopoly on cold began to collapse. For Frederick Tudor's successors, the writing was on the ice house wall. In Boston, once the beating heart of the American ice industry, warehouses started to shudder. Ice ponds, which had once echoed with the metallic scrape of saws and the barked orders of foremen, fell silent. Thoreau had written of the Crystal Palace being carved from Walton Pond. Now the palace was melting. Yet the decline wasn't sudden. In many rural and frontier communities, mechanical refrigeration was still out of reach. Ice continued to be cut, hauled, and sold in local markets across New England, Scandinavia, and Canada. It remained a household essential, stocked in ice boxes, chipped into lemonade, and used to cool the weary foreheads of the sick. In cities like New York, ice wagons still clattered down cobblestone streets. Children, especially in tenement neighborhoods, would follow these wagons to collect the thin, cold slivers that fell from blocks being delivered. Still, the shift was unstoppable. Where once ice had made the world smaller, connecting the frosted lakes of Massachusetts to the tropical markets of Calcutta, Rio de Janeiro, and Havana, now artificial cold was making geography irrelevant. Even as the industry withered in the US, a parallel transformation was taking place in India. The Calcutta Ice House, built in 1842, had become obsolete by the late 19th century. Once the crown jewel of Tudor's tropical empire, it was converted into offices by the 1880s. A building designed to keep ice frozen in 100-degree heat now served bureaucrats with paper and pens instead of sawdust and tongs. The very architecture of the ice trade was being repurposed. In Australia, the decline of ice shipping coincided with the emergence of a local refrigeration industry. Instead of relying on the seasonal whims of North American winters, Australians began producing their own cold, thereby severing the dependence on imports.
The globalized cold chain, an achievement that had once defied logic, was being replaced with localized control over temperature. Even more telling, the ice trade became a curiosity, something to be remembered, perhaps commemorated, but no longer practiced. Newspapers began to run stories not about new ice shipments, but about the nostalgic echoes of the trade. Editorials reminisced about the ice harvest days, romanticizing the laborers and horses, the glint of sun on frozen ponds, and the communal ritual of storage. And yet, the end of the trade brought more than economic consequences. It shifted how people thought about nature, industry, and human ambition. Consider this. The ice trade was, at its core, a way of capturing a fleeting natural state, winter, and preserving it long past its expiration. It was an industry born of paradox. To make heat bearable, you had to hoard cold. To cool the tropics, you need to suffer through northern winters. And doing so, people in the 19th century unintentionally built the first global system of temperature control. And they did it without electricity, digital sensors, or climate-controlled warehouses. This feat, boring as it may sound now, was not merely about comfort. It was about survival, especially in regions where disease ran rampant. In colonial India and the West Indies, access to ice improved sanitation, preserved medicine, and helped reduce food spoilage. Even if the imperial motives were self-serving, the benefits often extended to local populations, in ways that are still debated by historians today. Ironically, the rise of mechanical refrigeration introduced its own complications. The chemicals used in early systems were toxic and prone to leaks. Later developments like Freon helped stabilize refrigeration, but introduced greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The long arc from natural ice to artificial cold had profound consequences, many of which are still unfolding. We often think about revolutions in terms of fire, steam, or electricity, but the quiet conquest of the cold, of learning how to produce, store, and manipulate it, was one of the most significant yet underappreciated shifts in modern history. And yet, in towns like Winchester, Massachusetts, remnants of the ice trade still linger. Old ice houses, repurposed as boathouses or museums, remain beside ponds that once echoed with commerce. Some lakes still freeze over in winter, and occasionally someone might point and say, "That's where the ice cutters used to work." You can almost hear it. The soft clink of metal on ice, the snort of horses in the cold, the steady rhythm of men hauling blocks from shore to sled. It's a sound you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, a sound of history forgotten. So as you rest, let your mind drift back to the creaking wagons, the frost-covered holds of ships crossing the equator, and the saw-toothed edges of a trade that once turned water into gold. A trade that, though it melted, left behind something enduring. A world more connected by its extremes. A world where ice, once fragile and fleeting, became for a brief moment the very thing that held civilization together.
Story 4. The Guild of Goose Quill Makers. The quiet lives behind medieval bureaucracy. Ink, feathers, and the weight of silence. In the grand halls of medieval castles, kings passed judgments and nobles plotted alliances. But hidden beneath this thunderous surface of history
were the scribes, quiet, patient, and uncelebrated. Yet behind every decree, every charter, every whispered oath written down in the 13th century, there was a quill. And behind every quill, there was a quill maker. This is the story of the Goose Quill Makers Guild, a group of craftsmen and craftswomen so fundamental to the machinery of medieval administration, yet so seldom remembered, their names never etched in stone or echoed in song. Still, they held a power, not one of the sword, but of ink and feather, which silently shaped the way kingdoms were governed. By the mid-13th century, the use of the quill pen had become standard throughout Europe. Typically made from the flight feathers of geese, swans, and even crows, quills were prized for their flexibility and control over ink flow. But a good quill didn't come by accident. It had to be selected, treated, and cut with great skill. It wasn't simply about plucking a feather from a bird and dipping it in ink. No, the process was a quiet ritual that took patience, care, and most of all knowledge, passed through generations. In the bustling town of Bruges, nestled within the cloth trade and the spice merchants, a quieter guild formed, the Goose Quill Makers. Though overshadowed by the blacksmiths and goldsmiths, their small workshop, typically adjoining parchment sellers or scriveners, held its own significance. You might pass by their shop and hear little more than the soft sound of knives sharpening or boiling pots preparing feathers. A typical member of the guild, perhaps named Willem, would begin his morning not with ceremony, but with silence. He would heat a kettle of water, not for tea, but to soften the membranes of dried goose feathers. The feathers had already been aged for months, often tucked into rafters where dry air kept them brittle enough to cut. Boiling removed the inner goose membrane, the papery tissue that made writing uneven and ink unpredictable. This ritual, like so many things in his life, went unspoken, but deeply understood. Willem then sort his feathers, left wing versus right wing. Left wing feathers curving rightward were favored by right-handed scribes, and vice versa. Yes, even the curve of the feather mattered. The guild trained apprentices in this distinction, correcting them harshly when they mixed bundles. In the world of bureaucracy and illuminated manuscripts, a poor quill could ruin a day's work, or smear a page beyond repair. While the Guild of Goose Quill Makers was not the wealthiest, their influence quietly extended into the heart of medieval administration. Royal courts, clerical offices, and universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford required thousands of quills each month. The demand was constant. Ink faded, parchment cracked, but quills? They wore down daily, sometimes hourly. By conservative estimates, a single scribe working on manuscript copying could go through 3 to 5 quills a day. Now, multiply that by 1,000 scribes across Europe, and it becomes clear that someone had to keep up. And that someone, more often than not, was a quiet guild member in a town like Bruges. Feathers were bought in bulk from goose farmers who sold sacks of molted or plucked feathers to city traders. The best feathers came from geese raised on grain diets, softer shafts, smoother tips. The guild would inspect them by lamplight, checking the integrity of the shaft for cracks. Each feather that passed inspection was tagged with a wax seal, proving guild craftsmanship. Quill cutting became its own specialization. The shaping of the nib, the slit that allowed ink to flow onto parchment, was done with small knives called pen knives. The term still survives today, although most people have forgotten why it exists.
The tip of the quill had to be cut at a precise angle. Too shallow, and the ink would flood. Too steep, and it wouldn't flow. Guild apprentices trained for months on discarded feathers before ever shaping one for sale. Sometimes they would be sent to observe scribes' writing, studying their hand angles and pressure to tailor quills accordingly. The guild didn't just make tools. They observed users, understood their needs, and shaped their craft around function, all without fanfare or fame. The Goose Quill Workshop was a place of earthy smells and quiet repetition. The scent of boiled feathers mingled with wax, ink, and dried parchment. Wooden racks held feathers in stages of preparation, some drying, some softening, some cured and ready to cut. A master quill maker like Willem might train 2 or 3 apprentices at a time, many of whom were children from modest families. Guild records, though scarce, indicate that girls were occasionally allowed to train, especially in towns with female scriveners or convent scriptoria. Apprentices spent long hours sorting feathers, sharpening knives, and watching the subtle techniques of the master, how to cut the tip without cracking the shaft, or how to burnish the nib with pumice stone, or how to test ink flow by gently drawing figures on scrap parchment. Lunch was often silent, taken with fingers still stained in walnut ink or lamp black. Bread, cheese, and a cold broth made from marrow bones. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The work was in its own language. After lunch, more cutting, more shaping, and finally, bundling. Finished quills were tied with twine into bundles of 12, sometimes dipped lightly in beeswax to preserve them. They would be sent out to university bookstores, monastery scriptoria, or directly to chancellery clerks. While the town square buzzed with traders, livestock, and laughter, the guild worked in quiet continuity. It was their silence that kept the words of kings flowing. Despite their importance, the Guild of Goose Quill Makers remained in the shadows. They had no patron saint, no cathedral dedicated to their work. While blacksmiths were immortalized in statues and stonemasons carved their faces into chapels, the quill maker's mark was a faint line of ink on forgotten parchment. Even within guild hierarchies, they ranked low. In cities like Paris or London, the quill makers were often lumped with parchment sellers or penknife makers, barely considered their own craft. Guild masters sometimes had to pay extra to participate in civic ceremonies. Their banners were simple, usually a goose feather on a field of ink blue. Yet, without them, legal contracts would not be signed, Bibles would not be copied, love letters would not be written. Bureaucracy would wither. The written word relied on the feather, and the feather relied on them. So much depended on this seemingly boring but vital art of shaping a piece of goosewing. The guild's reach, while silent, had moments of sudden visibility. When a major council was held, like the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, or a treaty negotiated, such as the Treaty of Paris in 1259, thousands of documents had to be penned. Who supplied the tools for this flood of ink? Quill makers. Some records from York mentioned emergency shipments of quills dispatched to London during tax season. Others from Bologna speak of university students complaining about overpriced quills, suggesting not only demand, but sometimes scarcity. Wars came and went, but writing never paused. Even during sieges or plague outbreaks, messengers rode between towns carrying letters, and each letter needed a quill. Still, the makers were never named. As the late evening fell on Bruges and the candles were snuffed, a master quill maker might sit alone in his corner, sharpening one last feather by moonlight. He knew it would be sent to a monastery, used by a friar copying psalms or by a notary writing a marriage record. He would never meet them. He would never know the words. But his work would live on. What does it mean to shape history without being remembered for it?
The spark beneath the ashes. It is often easy to dismiss the whispers of discontent among peasants, especially when their grievances seem small by the standards of the palace. A few sous more for a loaf of bread, after all, was barely a coin to a courtier at Versailles, who might spend more on the trimming of a hat feather than a poor family could afford to feed themselves for a week. But such whispers, in sufficient numbers, become rumblings. And by the early 1780s, those rumblings echoed from village ovens to city tenements until they roared beneath the marble foundations of the Ancien Regime. The women of France, especially those in the countryside and the swelling urban underclasses of Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux, began to share more than just bread lines. They shared strategies. These were not official unions or revolutionary clubs. These were gatherings at the well, murmured conversations during laundry by the river, shared murmurs over scarce turnips in open-air markets. Quiet, watchful, but increasingly coordinated. Some of these women were widows. Others were wives of men conscripted into wars they barely understood. Some were midwives, herbalists, seamstresses, and street vendors. They had no title, no formal power, and most were illiterate, but they held a collective memory of prices, patterns, and pain. Their memories told them something was deeply wrong. One of the earliest documented instances of localized resistance came not from Paris, but from Lyon in 1784. A woman known only in records as Mère Jeanne, a baker's wife, began distributing bread for free from her husband's oven. She did so not in defiance of her husband, but with his full agreement. The local grain merchant had been found hoarding grain in a locked granary just outside the city walls. By the time the authorities intervened, a quarter of the grain had spoiled. Infuriated, Mère Jeanne refused to sell her loaves at the newly inflated price. "We will bake what we have and we will feed who we can," she reportedly said. She and her husband were fined and briefly jailed, but the act stirred something in the district. For several days after, women in the markets began pricing their goods not in livres, but in loaves. 3 onions for a quarter of a loaf, they would say, not for coin. It was a subtle symbolic rebellion. Currency had betrayed them. Bread was now the measure of value. To understand the mechanics of this slow-burning revolt, one must grasp the workings of the grain supply in France at the time. Grain passed through a chain of intermediaries, from grower to collector, from collector to regional granary, from granary to baker or miller. Each step introduced delay, cost, and often corruption. The key villain in the eyes of the people was not the farmer, nor even the king directly, but the économistes, the government officials and theorists who believed in a laissez-faire model for grain pricing. They promoted deregulation, allowing middlemen to speculate on grain futures and to sell to the highest bidder, even if that meant exporting French grain while French citizens starved. This led to grotesque scenes of abundance and hunger side by side. In 1785, near Reims, a convoy of grain carts was mobbed by peasants. The carts, it turned out, were bound not to the local town, but for export through the port of Calais. While villagers ate bread stretched with ground acorns, their local harvest was being sold to foreign buyers. Women led that mob. The term femme du pain, women of the bread, began appearing in local journals and pamphlets, at first used mockingly by clerics and conservative journalists. The phrase was later reclaimed by women as a symbol of resilience and rebellion. In Rouen, in 1786, a group of women began staging what came to be called the loaf protests. They would gather at the central market in silence, each holding a single small loaf of bread in their apron, and stare down the local officials as they arrived to oversee the market. They did not chant, shout, or throw stones. They simply stood, some with infants tied to their backs, some pregnant, others gray-haired with bread held like a relic. The image caught the imagination of pamphleteers. One anonymous writer described the protest as an icon of the nation's hunger, where the bread is no longer blessed, but begged. The city council eventually banned loitering with food in public places. But the damage to the monarchy's image was already deepening. Historians often focus on the dramatic events that followed the storming of the Bastille in 1789, the March on Versailles, but these early quiet acts of protest set the stage. They built the moral and emotional case against the monarchy, not in philosophy, but in flesh and flower. In dozens of small towns, women began keeping ledger books of food prices, primitive, unofficial records that today are some of the only evidence we have of how inflation ravaged feudal France. One such book, found in the village of Autun, meticulously records the price of rye bread for every week between 1782 and 1789. The margins contain bitter commentary. Price: 5 sous. Flour is not clean. Sickened my daughter. Price: 6 sous. Better to eat roots. Price: 7 sous. Pray for a storm to drive the lords from their cellars. These ledger keepers, often elderly women tasked with managing household accounts, began cross-referencing their notes in letters, some of which survive today in archives. A woman from Dijon wrote to her cousin in Tours, "We live not in years anymore, but in seasons of hunger." This is how knowledge was built, not through universities, but through kitchens and bread queues, not through treatises, but through tears and stubbornness. Men in the background. It may be tempting to assume that male figures dominated this narrative, as was typical in 18th century France. But in these early years of the bread revolt, many men were absent, working seasonal labor, fighting in foreign wars, or themselves weakened by hunger. This absence left a vacuum, one woman filled out of necessity, not ambition. There were exceptions, of course. A few sympathetic priests turned over church cellars to store grain for the poor. Some millers, under pressure from local women, began trading flour directly for labor or food rather than currency. But it was women who bore the brunt of confrontation. It was women who dragged their feet through mud to bargain with farmers. women who risked public humiliation for shouting in markets, women who baked with spoiled flour to keep their children from starving. It is important to note that none of this was considered revolutionary at the time. These were not women calling for the end of monarchy. They were calling for the right to live, to eat, and to feed their families without degradation. And yet, the monarchy did not listen. By late 1787, Paris was teetering. The city had grown by over 100,000 residents in a generation, and its food infrastructure was cracking under the weight. Bakeries were overworked, grain prices were out of sync with wages. Rumors flew daily. One of the most dangerous rumors was that of a flour ring, called the Pacte de Famille, a secret cabal of aristocrats hoarding grain to starve the poor into submission. There was no proof, but there didn't need to be. Perception had already curdled. The intendant of Paris, alarmed by the unrest, imposed temporary price controls, but it was too little, too late. Food riots erupted in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine district in January 17.
Marching to Versailles, when hunger became power. By the summer of 1789, Paris was a city simmering on the edge of upheaval. Months of bread shortages, spiraling prices, and increasingly bold protests had laid bare a nation's fragility. But the revolt that had begun quietly in market squares and village ovens was about to explode onto the grandest stage of all, the royal palace at Versailles. This is the story of how the women of France, once dismissed as silent victims of poverty, became the catalysts for a revolution that reshaped the modern world. It was October 5th, 1789, when thousands of women, many of them market vendors and mothers clutching baskets or bundles of twigs for firewood, began their march from the markets of Paris to the Palace of Versailles. Their grievances were not political theories scribbled in pamphlets or debates in smoky salons. Their demands were elemental: bread and justice. The roads to Versailles were clogged with carts, children, and the elderly. Some women carried weapons: pitchforks, knives, sticks, anything to defend themselves against soldiers or palace guards who had orders to maintain order by any means. The royal court, despite weeks of warnings, was taken by surprise. What had driven them here? The relentless hunger that gnawed at families, the heavy taxes imposed to feed a bloated aristocracy, the arrogance of a king who seemed indifferent to the suffering outside his gates. This march was not spontaneous, though it appeared so. It was the culmination of years of quiet organization, whispered plans, and desperate courage. The women who led it had tasted defeat in previous protests, but refused to be silenced. Among the marchers were those like Jean Roland, a fishmonger known in her district for defying merchant price gouging, and Thérèse Lamone, a seamstress whose husband had died in debt, leaving her to fend for 4 children alone. The Palace of Versailles, a symbol of opulence and divine right, suddenly found itself encircled by a flood of bodies. Guards struggled to maintain order. The king and queen, surrounded by courtiers and advisors, watched anxiously from their balconies. Women pushed their way past barricades. They demanded an audience with the king,
shouting, "Bread! Bread for our children!" Inside, the air was thick with fear and disbelief. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, reportedly said, "Let them eat cake," though historians debate the authenticity of this phrase. Whether myth or reality, it became a rallying cry for the oppressed. What happened next would mark one of the most significant moments in the early French Revolution. The marchers breached the palace gates. Some accounts describe scenes of chaos, women confronting guards, tossing furniture, breaking windows. Others recall more measured moments where women negotiated, pleaded, and threatened. King Louis XVI agreed, reluctantly, to address the crowd. He promised to order grain shipments to Paris and to lower bread prices. It was a political move, but the women had forced it. The march didn't end at Versailles. It marked the beginning of the king's effective relocation to Paris. No longer could he ignore the needs of his people or retreat behind palace walls. For the women who marched, the event was a rare moment of political agency. They had forced royal attention in a way philosophers and nobles could not. Yet their influence was short-lived. While men debated constitutions and formed clubs, many women found themselves pushed back into the shadows. Women were barred from voting, holding office, or attending the new assemblies. Still, the symbolic power of their march endured. It demonstrated that hunger could fuel revolution, that those deemed silent had voices loud enough to shake thrones. Though overshadowed in history books by the battles and speeches of men, the breadwomen left a lasting mark. They taught future generations about the power of collective action grounded in everyday struggle. In 1791, a group of women petitioned the National Assembly for the right to bear arms to protect their families and neighborhoods. Their requests were ignored. Yet in the years that followed, women participated in uprisings, spread revolutionary pamphlets, and risked imprisonment for their beliefs. Their story is one of quiet strength, of mothers, sisters, and daughters who understood that the simplest demands, like the right to eat, could become the foundation for vast social change. The bread tax revolt shows how the mundane prices of flour, the weight of loaves, and the daily chore of feeding a family can become a powerful force when ignored by those in power. It reminds us that history is not just shaped in courts or battlefields, but in markets, kitchens, and on the feet of those who march out of necessity. Even today, when food security remains a challenge worldwide, the echoes of those women's courage remind us of the fragile links between survival and governance.
Story 5. The Great Stink of London, 1858. How Sewage Changed a City. The smell that brought a city to its knees. Imagine walking the bustling streets of Victorian London in the summer of 1858. The air is thick, but not with the expected fog London is famous for. Instead, a foul stench clings to everything: the river, the air, even the clothes on the line. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was unbearable. For weeks, the smell had grown worse, invading homes and public buildings alike.
This was the Great Stink, one of the most overlooked yet profoundly impactful events in London's history. It was a disaster not caused by war or fire, but by centuries of human waste stagnating in the River Thames. The story begins much earlier, in a city rapidly outgrowing its medieval infrastructure. By the mid-19th century, London had exploded in size. From a population of around 1 million in 1800, it had grown to more than 3 million by 1850. The city sprawled along the Thames, and its narrow streets and ancient sewers had not been designed to cope with this rapid expansion. In fact, many medieval cesspits and open drains still emptied directly into the Thames, which doubled as the city's main source of drinking water and its primary sewer. This practice had consequences that were slowly but surely poisoning Londoners. Cholera outbreaks were frequent and deadly. The last major epidemic before the Great Stink struck in 1854, claiming thousands of lives. Yet, despite the clear link between sanitation and disease, many officials were slow to respond. Meanwhile, waste piled up. Summer heat intensified the smell and helped bacteria flourish in the river. By June 1858, the stench was so bad that members of Parliament could not conduct business in the House of Commons without windows shut tight and wet towels pressed to their faces. The Great Stink forced the city to confront an ancient problem in a modernizing world. Section 2. The Great Stink of London, 1858. Engineering a solution. The unbearable odor of the summer of 1858 was more than just a nuisance. It was a catalyst. London was forced to reckon with a crisis that had been building for centuries. The Great Stink made plain the inadequacies of the city's sanitation infrastructure and pushed lawmakers and engineers toward one of the most ambitious public works projects of the Victorian era. Beneath the crowded streets of London, the city's sewer system was a confusing tangle of pipes, ditches, and open channels, many dating back to Roman times or the Middle Ages. For centuries, waste from homes, markets, and factories had been dumped into the nearest watercourse or cesspit, which often overflowed during heavy rains. The River Thames served both as a source of drinking water for many and as an open sewer for the city's filth. This dual use was disastrous. The lower river, the tidal section running through London, was especially polluted with untreated human waste, industrial effluents, and garbage. Several cholera outbreaks in the early 19th century had already raised alarms. In 1854, physician John Snow famously traced a cholera outbreak in Soho to a contaminated public water pump on Broad Street, demonstrating the link between contaminated water and disease. Yet, despite this, London's authorities remained slow to act, largely because sewage management was complex, expensive, and politically fraught. Many property owners resisted changes that threatened their basements or land.
Others simply didn't grasp the scale of the public health crisis. In 1856, the Metropolitan Board of Works appointed Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer, to design a comprehensive sewer system for London. Bazalgette was a man of practical mind and methodical approach. His design would reshape the city's subterranean landscape and set new standards for urban sanitation. Bazalgette proposed a network of intercepting sewers that would capture waste before it reached the Thames in central London and redirect it downstream beyond the city limits. His plan involved constructing massive brick-lined tunnels, pumping stations, and embankments along the river. His vision was audacious for the time. The sewers would be large enough to accommodate the city's expected growth for decades to come, with an extensive network stretching over 1,100 miles. Bazalgette's work was monumental in both scale and ambition. The project required not only vast amounts of materials, millions of bricks and tons of Portland cement, but also intricate planning to avoid disrupting the city's roads, buildings, and underground structures like the early London Underground. Despite the clear need, Bazalgette's plans faced opposition. The project was costly, estimated initially at over £4 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Many politicians balked at such expense, especially as Britain was involved in foreign wars and had other pressing fiscal priorities. Moreover, some officials underestimated the public health risk, viewing foul smells as unpleasant but tolerable. The phrase miasma theory, the idea that diseases were spread by bad air rather than contaminated water, was still widely accepted. This delayed acceptance of scientific evidence about germs and bacteria. Yet, by the summer of 1858, with Parliament literally choking on the stench, public and political pressure became impossible to ignore. The Great Stink served as a visceral reminder that ignoring sewage was no longer an option. Queen Victoria, who often sailed the Thames, reportedly ordered investigations after her own experience of the smell. Newspapers ran headlines urging urgent reforms. Bazalgette's scheme began the enormous task in late 1858, digging deep trenches across London's neighborhoods, often disrupting daily life and traffic. Laborers worked in cramped conditions, tunneling beneath busy streets with rudimentary ventilation and lighting. The intercepting sewers collected waste from smaller local sewers and carried it eastwards to treatment works beyond the city. The most famous of these was the Abbey Mills pumping station, completed in 1865, which used steam-powered pumps to raise sewage to higher ground. The Victoria Embankment was constructed concurrently as a byproduct of the project, reclaiming land from the Thames to house some of the main sewer lines, as well as new roads and a section of the London Underground. It was a marvel of urban engineering that married function with aesthetic improvements. One of Bazalgette's lasting legacies was his approach to redundancy. Knowing that the future would bring even greater demands, he built sewers larger than what current needs required. An engineering for
The legacy beneath the streets. how Victorian sewers shaped modern cities. The stench that brought Parliament to its knees in the summer of 1858 was more than just a moment of discomfort. It was the tipping point for a revolution beneath the streets of London, one that would reshape the city and the world forever. The completion of Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system was not the end, but the beginning of a new era in urban sanitation, public health, and civic engineering. When the final sections of London's interceptor sewers were completed in the early 1870s, they represented a triumph of planning, engineering, and political will. For the first time, a major city had a comprehensive system designed specifically to remove human waste and protect drinking water supplies on a large scale. The immediate effects were clear. Waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery became far less common. Death rates in London began to drop, particularly among children. The city that had once been synonymous with filth and disease now stood as a model for others to follow. Cities across Europe, North America, and even parts of Asia looked to Bazalgette's work as an inspiration. Paris, New York, Berlin, and Tokyo embarked on their own sewer construction projects, adapting the principles pioneered beneath London's streets. The Great Stink also accelerated a fundamental change in how governments approached public health. Prior to the crisis, many officials and citizens believed in the miasma theory, that disease was spread by bad air. This belief led to attempts to mask odors with perfumes and incense, rather than addressing the root causes. Bazalgette's system, by physically removing waste from populated areas, contributed to the growing acceptance of germ theory, championed by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. As it became understood that contaminated water and waste were vectors for disease, sanitation infrastructure became a top priority. The Victorian era saw the birth of modern public health departments, water treatment plants, and regulations on waste disposal. These innovations were direct descendants of the response to the Great Stink. While Bazalgette and politicians received public accolades, the men who labored day and night to build the sewers remained largely anonymous. Thousands of workers, many of them immigrants or from the working class, dug tunnels by hand, often risking injury, illness, and even death. Their work was grueling and dangerous. Gas pockets in the tunnels caused suffocation and explosions. Structural collapses were common. The night soil men, who emptied cesspits and transported human waste to be dumped outside the city, faced social stigma and health hazards. Yet these men were the backbone of the transformation that made London a healthier place to live. Their toil beneath the city was the foundation on which modern urban life was built. Bazalgette's sewer system did not immediately make the Thames clean. It simply moved sewage downstream, away from the city center. Over time, with the construction of sewage treatment facilities and stricter regulations, the river gradually recovered. Today, the Thames is one of the cleanest urban rivers in the world, home to fish, birds, and recreational boaters. This recovery owes much to the groundwork laid in the Victorian era, starting with the Great Stink Crisis.
The transformation of the Thames from a fetid open sewer to a celebrated natural resource symbolizes the broader evolution of cities from places of squalor and disease to centers of culture and innovation. The story of the Great Stink reminds us that infrastructure, sewers, clean water, waste disposal is fundamental to the health and functioning of any city. It also shows how political will and public pressure can drive change, even when that change is difficult and expensive. Modern cities still face sanitation challenges, especially in rapidly growing urban areas in the developing world. The Victorian response to the Great Stink offers lessons in foresight, scale, and commitment to public welfare. Additionally, the Great Stink teaches that neglecting the mundane problems, like sewage and waste, can lead to crises with vast social and economic consequences. Sometimes the boring aspects of city management are the most important. Today, the Great Stink might seem an odd choice for a historical story. After all, it's about smell and sewage, subjects usually avoided in polite conversation. But its significance is enormous. It illustrates how history is not just shaped by kings and battles, but also by engineers, laborers, and citizens who demand change. It underscores the interplay between environment, health, technology, and society. And perhaps most importantly, it shows that even a city as grand as London can be brought low by the accumulation of small, ignored problems, until finally, something as simple as a smell becomes impossible to overlook.
Story 6. The Silent Architects of the Silk Road, Caravan Leaders Who Shaped Eurasia. Paths across the endless steppe. Imagine a world without planes, trains, or automobiles, only vast deserts, towering mountains, and endless steppes separating cities and empires. For over a millennium, from roughly 200 BCE to the 15th century CE, the Silk Road connected east and west across these immense distances, enabling trade, cultural exchange, and sometimes conflict. But the grand story of emperors and traders is incomplete without acknowledging the silent architects behind these journeys, the caravan leaders. These were men and occasionally women who risked their lives guiding enormous caravans laden with silk, spices, horses, and ideas across deserts, mountains, and hostile territories. Their knowledge of the land, negotiation skills, and leadership kept the fragile lifelines of trade alive. Yet history often overlooks their roles, focusing instead on merchants or emperors. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a sprawling network of routes connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, and Europe. Its paths crisscrossed deserts like the Taklamakan and the Gobi, and carved through mountain ranges such as the Pamirs and the Tian Shan. Caravans ranged from a few dozen camels carrying precious cargoes to massive convoys of hundreds of animals and hundreds of people. Each caravan journey could take months or even years, depending on the distance and conditions. The goods transported were diverse: Chinese silk and porcelain, spices from India, horses from Central Asia, glassware from the Roman Empire, and later paper and gunpowder technology traveling westward. At the head of these caravans was the Bashi, the caravan leader. The Bashi was not just a navigator, but a manager, diplomat, and protector. His responsibilities extended beyond steering the caravan along dusty trails. He negotiated passage rights with local rulers and nomadic tribes,
often paying tolls or tributes to ensure safe passage. He balanced relationships between traders, local communities, and sometimes rival caravans. The Bashi managed supplies, schedules, and the welfare of animals and people alike. These leaders had to be expert strategists, capable of making quick decisions in the face of bandits, sandstorms, or sudden shortages of water. Many were seasoned locals, born and raised along the Silk Road, intimately familiar with the ever-changing political and environmental landscape. Others came from merchant families, inheriting leadership roles passed down through generations. The Silk Road was fraught with peril. Beyond the physical hardships, blistering heat, freezing cold, treacherous mountain passes, caravans faced threats from bandits and warring factions. Political borders could shift suddenly, turning friendly territory into hostile ground. Caravan leaders maintained alliances with local warlords or tribal chieftains. They sometimes hired armed guards or formed caravans large enough to deter attacks. But not all dangers came from violence. Water sources could dry up, forcing detours. Seasonal changes required careful timing. Too early and snow blocked passes. Too late and monsoon rains transformed roads into mud. Despite these dangers, the Bashi saw opportunity. They arranged trade deals, matched buyers and sellers, and ensured that goods reached markets safely. Their success depended on balancing risk and reward. Caravans were not just vehicles for trade, but mobile communities. They included merchants, laborers, guides, cooks, animal handlers, and sometimes entertainers or priests. The Bashi was the leader of this diverse group, maintaining order and morale. Long journeys meant conflicts could arise over food, pay, or routes. The caravan leader had to arbitrate disputes and enforce discipline without alienating his followers. Stories passed along the Silk Road recount caravan leaders who earned respect through fairness and toughness. Some were known to punish thieves harshly. Others shared food generously during shortages. The bonds formed on these journeys often lasted lifetimes, creating networks of trust crucial for future trade. While caravan leadership was predominantly male, exceptions existed. Kutulun, a noblewoman and warrior from the 13th century Mongol Empire, is famed for her strength and leadership. Although more known for military exploits, she reportedly led groups across the steppes, embodying the qualities needed for caravan leadership: courage, negotiation, and strategy. Her story reminds us that leadership on the Silk Road could take many forms, and that women, though rarely recorded in official histories, played vital roles. The caravans enabled not just trade, but the spread of culture, religion, and technology. Buddhism traveled from India to China along these routes. Paper-making and gunpowder technology moved westward. Caravan leaders in facilitating this exchange helped shape the modern world. Their choices affected which goods and ideas reached which destinations, influencing everything from cuisine to warfare. Yet despite their critical role, the Bashi's name rarely appears in history books. As the sun sets over the dunes and the camels settle in for the night, the caravan leader's job is far from over. He must watch for threats, plan the next day's route, and keep the caravan united. What does it take to guide not just a group of travelers, but an entire world of connections across vast, unforgiving lands?
Trials, tribulations, and the unseen diplomacy of the caravan leaders. The vast open spaces of the Silk Road could be breathtaking. Endless horizons stretching beyond the eye's reach, star-filled nights that seem to hold the secrets of the ages. But behind the romantic image of silk and spices lay a grueling reality, one that caravan leaders had to master daily. In this section, we explore the immense challenges these leaders faced as they navigated not only geography, but a complex web of politics, economics, and human relationships. Their ability to survive and to keep their caravans alive depended on a combination of grit, diplomacy, and foresight. The Silk Road's routes were as diverse as the lands they crossed. One day, a caravan might be trudging through the scorching sands of the Taklamakan Desert, where temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius, and water was scarce. The next, the same group could be scaling mountain passes, hundreds of feet above sea level, facing freezing winds and treacherous ice. Caravan leaders had to be expert geographers and meteorologists long before those sciences existed in formal terms. They learned when to depart, which paths to take, and where to seek shelter based on patterns handed down over generations. For example, the Taklamakan Desert was known as the Sea of Death because of its harsh environment. Leaders timed crossings during cooler months and avoided monsoon seasons that could turn dusty trails into mud and rivers into raging torrents. They also carefully planned water stops, oases that might be weeks apart. Losing access to one water source could doom an entire caravan. Stories survive of desperate caravans forced to abandon goods or even leave behind animals to survive. Banditry was an omnipresent danger. The Silk Road's immense wealth attracted thieves, pirates, and entire bands of raiders who preyed on isolated caravans. Caravan leaders often negotiated protection payments, tributes, to local warlords or tribal leaders to guarantee safe passage. These payments were expensive, but often cheaper than the losses from an ambush. In some cases, large caravans would employ armed guards, including skilled horsemen and archers, to repel attackers. But this militarization came at a cost, and sometimes provoked local hostilities. When conflict was unavoidable, caravan leaders had to choose between fighting, fleeing, or negotiating. Decisions made in moments of crisis affected lives and cargo worth thousands of silver coins. Negotiation was the invisible battleground of caravan leadership. The routes passed through many political entities, each with its own rulers, customs, and demands. Caravan leaders had to be diplomats, fluent not just in language, but in local customs and expectations. Failure to observe protocol could lead to imprisonment, confiscation of goods, or worse. Many leaders carried letters of safe passage from powerful patrons or arranged marriages to strengthen alliances with local tribes. In addition, they negotiated prices and terms with local merchants and officials at each stop. They balanced competing interests, ensuring that goods moved efficiently while minimizing conflict. Inside the caravan itself, leadership was a delicate balance. The caravan leader was responsible for hundreds of people: merchants, servants, guides, cooks, and animal handlers. Each had different needs and priorities. Disputes over pay, rest periods, or shared resources were common. A single quarrel could spark larger conflicts, threatening the cohesion necessary for survival. The Bashi had to be both a manager and mediator, maintaining morale and discipline while listening to grievances. They often held councils or meetings to discuss plans and problems. Leadership styles varied. Some leaders were strict and authoritarian, enforcing harsh punishments for rule breaking. Others were more inclusive, earning loyalty through fairness and generosity. The Silk Road was not just a trade route for goods, but a conduit for ideas and beliefs. Caravan leaders often had to respect diverse religious traditions and facilitate religious practices among their members and local communities. Caravans included Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, and others, each observing different festivals, dietary laws, and customs. Leaders sometimes coordinated stops at important shrines or temples, providing spiritual support that helped maintain group cohesion. The position of caravan leader came with great prestige, but also great risk. Loss of a caravan to natural disaster or attack could ruin a leader's reputation and finances. Caravan leaders often invested their own money or relied on wealthy sponsors. Failure meant debts, loss of honor, and sometimes exile. Yet those who succeeded amassed wealth and influence. Some became key players in regional politics or advisors to rulers. One renowned caravan leader was Nasir al-Din, who operated in the 14th century around Samarkand. He is remembered in local chronicles for his wisdom and courage. Nasir al-Din's caravan once encountered a fierce storm near the Altai Mountains that stranded the group for weeks. He negotiated with local tribes for shelter and supplies, avoiding conflict through gifts and diplomacy. His ability to navigate natural and human challenges earned him respect across Central Asia. The caravan leader's resilience and ingenuity kept the arteries of Eurasian trade open for centuries, enabling the exchange of goods and ideas that shaped civilizations. But these men and women often remain silent figures, overshadowed by the glories of empires they helped connect. What inner strengths and decisions allowed these caravan leaders to survive such immense pressures? How did their roles evolve as political powers changed across the Silk Road?
End of an era, and the legacy of the caravan leaders. As the centuries turned and empires rose and fell, the great caravan routes of the Silk Road continued to pulse with life. For over 1,000 years, caravan leaders navigated the treacherous deserts, mountains, and shifting politics, holding together a fragile but vital network of trade and culture. But by the late 15th and 16th centuries, profound changes began to alter the landscape not just of the trade routes, but of the very role caravan leaders played. The advent of new maritime routes in the late 15th and early 16th centuries marked a significant turning point. Explorers like Vasco da Gama opened sea passages to Asia, allowing ships to bypass the dangerous and slow overland routes. Maritime trade became faster, cheaper, and more reliable. This shift led to a gradual decline in the importance of the Silk Road's land caravans. Cities that had thrived as caravan hubs like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar faced economic challenges. The once bustling caravanserais grew quieter. The Ottoman Empire's control over key Middle Eastern passages also disrupted traditional Silk Road commerce, imposing tariffs and restrictions that hindered overland trade. While some caravan routes persisted well into the 18th and 19th centuries, their prominence diminished in the shadow of maritime supremacy. As the volume of overland trade shrank, caravan leaders adapted. Some transitioned into local merchants or political figures. Their extensive knowledge of routes, diplomacy, and cultures allowed them to remain influential even as their caravans grew smaller. Others became guides or military leaders, applying their skills in navigation and negotiation to new contexts. In some frontier regions where sea routes were impractical, caravan leaders remained vital for centuries. The spread of goods like tea, salt, and precious stones continued to rely on their expertise. Beyond their role in commerce, caravan leaders served as cultural intermediaries. Their interactions with diverse peoples helped shape the exchange of ideas, art, and religion along the Silk Road. They facilitated the spread of Buddhism from India to China as monks and pilgrims traveled alongside merchants. Similarly, Islamic culture expanded eastward through caravan networks. These leaders sometimes carried manuscripts, relics, and art, enriching the cultural tapestry of Eurasia.
Their ability to navigate between cultures, languages, and customs made them critical agents of cultural diffusion. Today, the routes of the Silk Road inspire fascination and tourism, with many retracing ancient paths for historical and cultural exploration. Yet, the caravan leaders who sustained these routes remain largely uncelebrated. Their stories are buried beneath the grandeur of empires, the writings of merchants, and the conquests of armies. Modern infrastructure, railways, highways, and air routes have replaced camel caravans, but the principles of leadership they embody endure. The challenges of managing risk, negotiating diverse stakeholders, and navigating uncertainty are timeless. Some descendants of caravan leaders continue traditions of trade and guidance in Central Asia and beyond, preserving oral histories and cultural knowledge. The story of the caravan leaders teaches us about resilience in the face of adversity, the importance of local knowledge, and the power of leadership rooted in relationships. They thrived not by conquest, but through cooperation, building trust across cultural divides and managing complex logistics without modern technology. In a world now interconnected by digital networks, their legacy reminds us that human connection and leadership remain central. When we think of the Silk Road, we often imagine emperors, merchants, and grand cities, but it was the caravan leaders, the silent architects, who kept the routes alive. They braved deserts and mountains, negotiated with kings and tribes, and managed communities on the move. Their stories may lack the drama of battles or royal courts, but their impact resonates through centuries of cultural and economic history. By acknowledging their role, we gain a deeper understanding of how the seemingly ordinary, the day-to-day struggles of survival and leadership shaped the world we live in today.
Story 7. The Silent Sentinels of Pompeii. How ordinary citizens faced the fury of Vesuvius. Life on the edge of a sleeping giant. In the 1st century CE, Pompeii was a thriving Roman town nestled along the Bay of Naples, in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Its streets bustled with merchants, artisans, politicians, and families enjoying the pleasures of urban life. Yet, beneath this vibrant veneer lay a ticking time bomb, a volcano that had been dormant for centuries. Pompeii's citizens lived their daily lives with little awareness of the danger looming above. The fertile soil around Vesuvius allowed vineyards and farms to flourish, making the region prosperous. The town boasted baths, theaters, temples, and a complex water system, all hallmarks of Roman civilization. This story focuses not on emperors or generals, but on the ordinary people who lived on the edge of one of history's most catastrophic natural disasters. How did they perceive their environment? What signs did they notice? How did they cope with the sudden eruption that changed their world forever? Pompeii was home to around 11,000 to 15,000 inhabitants. Its streets echoed with the sounds of daily commerce, merchants hawking goods, children playing, craftsmen shaping stone and bronze. The Forum stood at the heart of the city, a place of business and social gathering. Markets overflowed with fresh produce, bread, olives, and wine. Public baths offered respite from the Mediterranean heat. Houses ranged from modest dwellings to opulent villas decorated with frescoes and mosaics. Life was both ordinary and vibrant. Citizens worshipped their gods, celebrated festivals, and engaged in politics. Like most Romans, they were confident in their mastery over nature and society. Despite its prominence, Vesuvius had not erupted in the collective memory of Pompeii's residents. Written records from earlier centuries mention eruptions in 1794 BCE and around 79 CE. But local oral traditions had largely faded. Vesuvius appeared as a gentle, forested mountain, a natural backdrop rather than a looming threat. The fertile volcanic soil was a source of pride and prosperity. Yet, geological forces were stirring beneath the surface. Magma slowly built pressure within the mountain, unbeknownst to the people below. In the days leading up to the eruption on August 24, 79 CE, residents noticed unusual phenomena. Some reported tremors and earthquakes shaking the region, though these were not uncommon in the seismically active area. Others observed strange clouds forming above the mountain, unusual smells, or animals behaving erratically. Unfortunately, such signs were often dismissed or misunderstood. Without scientific knowledge of volcanology, the people had no framework to interpret these ominous warnings. Local priests and soothsayers may have offered explanations, but there is little evidence that effective warnings were issued or that mass evacuations were planned. On that fateful morning, the eruption began with a towering column of ash and pumice shooting miles into the sky. The initial phase was marked by intense ashfall, darkening the sky and choking the air. Citizens scrambled to protect themselves, some fleeing the city, while others sought shelter indoors. The weight of falling ash caused roofs to collapse, crushing those who had taken refuge inside. Later, pyroclastic flows, fast-moving currents of hot gas and volcanic material, swept down the mountain, engulfing the city and killing those who remained. Archaeological excavations have uncovered poignant evidence of the eruption's human impact. Bodies preserved in ash-filled cavities tell stories of families clutching each other, vendors caught mid-sail, and individuals shielding their heads. These frozen moments reveal the panic, courage, and tragedy experienced by ordinary citizens in the face of unimaginable disaster. What did life mean to the people living under Vesuvius's shadow? And how did their ordinary experiences shape the way we understand disaster today?
The eruption unfolds. Chaos, courage, and the struggle to survive. As the sun rose over the Bay of Naples on August 24, 79 CE, the people of Pompeii began their daily routines,
unaware that their world was about to be transformed in an instant. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius would unfold over the course of 2 terrifying days, marked by ash, fire, and destruction, sealing the fate of the city and its inhabitants. Shortly after dawn, a violent explosion sent a massive plume of volcanic ash and pumice thousands of feet into the sky. The column, towering like a giant black tree, darkened the midday sun, turning the day into night. Ash began to rain down steadily on Pompeii and the surrounding towns. The falling ash was initially light, but quickly thickened. Roofs, built of heavy tiles, began to strain under the accumulating weight. Those outdoors scrambled to find shelter, covering their faces with cloth to avoid choking on the fine ash. For many, this first phase was confusing. The ash storm looked like a strange snow or hail, but the relentless fall soon smothered streets and homes. Some residents decided to flee immediately. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence show that many families packed what belongings they could carry and headed for the coast or the countryside. Yet the roads quickly became congested. Narrow streets crowded with people, carts, and animals slowed movement. The coastal harbor was crowded with those seeking to escape by boat, though many vessels were ill-prepared for a sudden evacuation. Others hesitated or refused to leave. Some likely believed the worst was over or that the gods would protect them. Others stayed to protect property or assist neighbors. As the ash continued to fall, roofs began to collapse under the weight, crushing those sheltering inside. The elderly, children, and the sick were especially vulnerable. Archaeologists have found numerous casts of victims trapped in homes and public buildings, their final moments preserved in remarkable detail. In some cases, people were found curled in beds or attempting to shield themselves. The city's infrastructure, water systems, markets, and homes was overwhelmed. The collapse of the urban environment compounded the disaster's deadly effects. After several hours of ashfall, the eruption shifted in character. Vesuvius released deadly pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas, ash, and volcanic rock that raced down the mountainous slopes at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. These flows obliterated everything in their path, incinerating people and structures. The heat was so intense that organic material was carbonized, preserving details of clothing, skin, and even facial expressions. Many victims were suffocated by the toxic gases before the flows struck. Despite the overwhelming destruction, some individuals survived, either by fleeing early or by taking refuge in less affected areas. Nearby towns, such as Herculaneum, protected by geography, endured different fates. Historical texts by Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the eruption from a distance, provide valuable eyewitness accounts. He describes the chaos, the terror, and the desperate attempts to save lives. Families were torn apart, some escaped by sea, others perished in the streets.
The eruption left thousands dead, with Pompeii buried under nearly 20 feet of volcanic debris. Pompeii remained lost for nearly 1,700 years, forgotten beneath layers of ash and earth, until its accidental rediscovery in the 18th century. Excavations revealed an extraordinary time capsule of Roman life. The preserved buildings, frescoes, and artifacts provide a window into the daily experiences of ordinary citizens, their homes, diets, trades, and social lives. The plaster casts of victims immortalize their final moments, reminding us of human vulnerability and resilience. The eruption of Vesuvius was not merely a geological event. It was a human tragedy and a testament to the unpredictability of nature. How did Pompeii's residents perceive their world before disaster struck? And what can their experiences teach us about facing crises today?
Lessons from the ashes, the enduring legacy of Pompeii's people. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE was one of history's most catastrophic volcanic events, but its legacy stretches far beyond the immediate destruction. The buried city of Pompeii offers us an unparalleled glimpse into the lives, hopes, and struggles of ordinary Romans who lived and died under the shadow of a sleeping giant. Their stories speak to resilience, vulnerability, and the complex relationship between humans and nature. The volcanic ash and pumice that engulfed Pompeii did more than destroy, it preserved. Unlike many ancient cities lost to time, Pompeii's sudden burial sealed its buildings, streets, and artifacts beneath a protective blanket. Frescoes remained vibrant, homes stood intact, and everyday objects lay exactly where their owners left them. Archaeologists uncovered not only grand villas and temples, but also humble shops, bakeries, and taverns. The city was a living organism, full of ordinary people engaged in routine tasks. This snapshot reveals details of Roman diet, social customs, religious practices, and even entertainment. Perhaps the most haunting discoveries are the plaster casts of the victims. When excavators poured plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies in the ash, they captured the shapes and final poses of people caught in the eruption's sudden fury. Some were huddled in doorways, clutching loved ones. Others crouched in fear or pain. These casts transform abstract statistics into individual stories: fathers shielding children, merchants abandoned at their stalls, slaves seeking shelter. This silent testimony humanizes the disaster, reminding us that Pompeii was not just a historical event, but a collective tragedy of countless lives. Pompeii's fate underscores the precarious balance humans maintain with the environment. The region's volcanic soil provided fertile farmland and prosperity, but concealed a lurking hazard. The people of Pompeii lived in harmony with the mountain, unaware of its potential for destruction. Their limited scientific understanding left them vulnerable to unexpected catastrophe. This tension between benefit and risk remains relevant today. Modern societies continue to settle in areas prone to earthquakes, hurricanes, or floods, often relying on technology and early warning systems to mitigate danger. The rediscovery of Pompeii has profoundly shaped our understanding of Roman civilization. Excavations continue to reveal new insights into urban planning, art, and social structures. Pompeii serves as a vital teaching tool for historians, volcanologists, and urban planners alike. It reminds us that ancient cities were complex, diverse communities with strengths and vulnerabilities much like our own. The site draws millions of visitors each year, fostering global awareness of history's lessons and humanity's shared heritage. The tragedy of Pompeii also offers cautionary lessons about disaster preparedness and response. In the absence of effective communication and evacuation plans, many lives were lost. Today, volcanic monitoring systems, emergency protocols, and public education campaigns aim to prevent such catastrophes. Yet challenges remain in balancing development with risk management, particularly in vulnerable regions. Pompeii's story encourages societies to respect nature's power, invest in infrastructure, and cultivate community resilience. The people of Pompeii were not famous heroes or rulers. They were bakers, merchants, children, and elders living everyday lives. Their experiences, preserved beneath volcanic ash, reveal how ordinary humans confront uncertainty, disaster, and change. Their courage, choices, and humanity continue to inspire reflection on how we live with risk and unpredictability. As we walk the streets of ancient Pompeii today, we step into the lives of those who lived, loved, and perished in the shadow of Vesuvius. Their silent voices echo across millennia, reminding us of our shared vulnerability and enduring spirit.